Thank you, Pastor, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Sabbath evening, and I hope the Holy Spirit will be with us and bless us all with wisdom tonight. We are going to be looking at one of the most important and timely topics in Bible prophecy, I think. The message is entitled America's Surprising Role in End Time Events. So I know that may sound really dramatic. It is dramatic, but it is not sensationalism. You know, we're going to take this message straight from the Bible, and it is a solemn warning for us, but it's also a message that's filled with hope. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to say first, though, some people do have questions about why should they even study prophecy. Some people say that there is no point in studying it. We can't understand it. Some people say that, it's so full of symbols and stuff. It just isn't. It's not for me. I am not interested. Some people say the book of Revelation can't even really be understood, and so they don't bother trying to study it. Some people are afraid of the catastrophic events that are predicted in it, and so they're afraid to even study it. So, the thing is, did you know that probably a third of the Bible is actually prophecy? So that tells us something important. God has always used prophecy to guide his people. So prophecy is not just about the future. It's God's way of revealing his plan for us. And he tells people in every age what it is that he's going to do so that his people can be prepared. So with that, let's go ahead and bow our heads for another word of prayer, if we could, please. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word and for the gift of prophecy. We thank you that you tell us ahead of time what's going to happen so that we can be prepared. Tonight, open our hearts and our minds and give us ears to hear and clear minds to understand, and give us hearts that are open and faithful to obey. So protect us from pride and protect us from fear, and fill us with hope, fill us with courage, and that we will be able to stand for you. So we pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Now, we've got the book of Daniel and the revelation of Jesus Christ, or the book of Revelation. And these were written approximately 600 years apart, but they should actually be studied together. And they actually really harmonize, even though they were written so far apart from each other. So the best way to interpret the prophecies are to study them together, right? So Pastor Eccles talked a week ago at our first presentation in this series. He talked about Daniel 2, and that provides the historical framework for all the prophecies in both books. And Daniel 7, what we end up seeing in Daniel 7 is it builds on Daniel 2. So we're going to refer to that a little bit. Daniel 7, though, is expanded and amplified in Revelation, particularly Revelation 13. And in it, we're going to see that there are two powers that emerge in the last days, and that have like this huge impact on world events. And the religious world. So like the global political world and the religious world. And these two powers are called the sea beast and the land beast. So we are going to be looking mostly at those, but we're going to start with Daniel 7, and you'll understand why we need to start with Daniel 7. As I said, it's expanded upon in Revelation 13. So we're going to start with Daniel 7. So Daniel 7 begins with him having a vivid dream, and he describes it in detail beginning in verse 2. And it says, Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from each other. So here we see that Daniel sees four beasts rising out of the sea. So the question is, what do beasts represent? So for that, we can just look a little further into Daniel 7 to verse 17, and we see the answer to this. It says, those great beasts, which are four, are 4 kings which arise out of the earth. So we know that those 4 beasts you saw are going to represent nations, or they're going to represent powers. Okay? So the Bible is interpreting itself here. These are not literal animals then. They're symbolic. And they represent world powers. And in Daniel's vision, we find out that these 4 kingdoms actually rule the world in succession, one right after another, with no break, one right after another. So, a lot of things to juggle here. We have a description of the 4 beasts, and Daniel actually goes into detail in verses 4 through 8 of Daniel 7. But we aren't going to have time to go into all the detail of each scripture. But we'll talk a little bit about the beasts. And we learn, though, with the help of the angel Gabriel, that the 4 beasts in Daniel's dream, and here they are. The 4 beasts in Daniel's dream correspond with the kingdoms that were represented, and that with the statue in Daniel 2. So they give the same sequence of empires that were depicted in Daniel 2, and as a statue of gold. Remember, it was gold and silver and bronze and the feet of clay and iron, right? But it ends up expanding on that a bit, so we get more detail this time. So the beasts that he saw represent the same powers, as I said, as what we saw in Daniel 2. But he sees them as beasts, okay, and not as a statue. So he saw a lion with eagle's wings. And the lion with eagle's wings is a common depiction of one of the primary Babylonian gods. And when you see things like from that time in Babylon, you always see this lion with the eagle's wings. And that Babylonian god's name was Marduk. And anyways, that's the same as the head of gold in Daniel 2. That represents Babylon. Okay? And so then he saw a bear raised up on one side. And that actually is Medo-Persia. And remember I said the angel Gabriel helped him understand what a lot of this was. Medo-Persia was depicted in Daniel 2 as the silver chest and arms in that statue. So that is the second beast that he saw. And the third beast that he saw was a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and that was Greece. Okay, and that corresponds then with Daniel 2 in that the belly of thighs and bronze were Greece, right? And the 4 heads, we're actually looking forward to a time when Alexander the Great, who actually did all that conquering for Greece, his kingdom would be divided 4 ways. And so that's what the 4 heads are then. So then finally we have the 4th beast, which he described as a terrible beast with iron teeth and horns. Later on you'll learn that it actually has like bronze feet as well. And so that actually symbolizes Rome, and that was in the statue of Daniel 2. That was the legs of iron. Okay? So that terrible beast that he was so worried about and he wanted to find out more about it was actually Rome. So these visions gave Daniel a glimpse of the future, outlining the succession of empires that would occur without interruption. So now, when we look back into history, we can see how perfectly predicted the sequence of world powers that would come about that actually really occurred in history. Not only were the actual empires predicted, but also details and qualities about those world powers and how they would overpower the nation before them. All of that was actually predicted. And so we just aren't going to go into all that much detail because it's a lot to cover. So right now, we're going to go on. And so he's talking about this 4th beast here, and which we identified as Rome. And Daniel said it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Well, when Rome fell, it broke into 10 divisions, and that is the foundation of modern Europe. And from these 10 horns, coming out of his head there, came the rise of a little horn, the little horn power, and that's discussed in Daniel and Revelation in a lot of detail. But Daniel 7 verse 8 goes on to say, I was considering those horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them. before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. So, out of Rome comes this new power, right? Small at first, but it grows. And the verse says that 3 of the horns would be plucked out. So these 3 powers are going to be totally eradicated. They're going to be totally, utterly destroyed. So then he continues and he says, and there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So there's a depiction of it there. Now, Daniel 7 verse 25 then gets into a little more detail and talks about some of the actions of this little horn. And it says, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and a half a time. And we'll be talking about that times and a half a time in a little while. But there's only one power in history that perfectly fits all these characteristics that are given in Daniel 7. So it's going to rise from the Great Sea, which is like a Hebrew term that they use when speaking about the Mediterranean. It comes up specifically out of the 4th kingdom, which was Rome, right? And that 4th kingdom is going to be split into 10 kingdoms. And then this little horn is going to come up, and it's going to totally eradicate 3 of those kingdoms. Well, and then it's going to have a head. It's going to have a head like a man's head, and it's going to blaspheme God and persecute God's people. So, if you take all of those characteristics into consideration, most historians are going to be able to tell you exactly what nation we are talking about here, or what power we're talking about here. The only power that in history that perfectly fits all these characteristics is actually the papacy. Okay. The deposing of the last emperor of Rome and the destruction of these 3 kingdoms, the 3 horns that were plucked out with the rising of the little horn, that paved the way for the Bishop of Rome to take the throne. And then that also paved the way for him taking like the civil power as well under his reign. So we should note that this is not about individuals that are in the Catholic faith, that are Roman Catholics. We're not talking about individuals. We're talking about systems here, right? So we are not criticizing or diminishing the faith of anybody that is a Christian at all in any of this in this talk that we have. But we're talking about systems. Okay, so let's remember that. Oops. Shortcut here. Now, let me also mention here that, and this is a little bit technical. I have a handout there in case you don't remember this right off. But because this same time period, we talked about time, and a half a time is how long this power was going to rule. It's referred to in a bunch of different ways in Revelation and in Daniel. And we see here that the saints are going to be given into his hands for time, times, and a half a time. Well, the time in the original language of Aramaic is 1 complete cycle of seasons. So that's 1 year. Okay? So times would be a pair of those. So it would be like 2 years. And then a half a time is a half a year. So totally we get 3.5 years out of that. Okay? So it's often translated that way as 3.5 years. This same time period is mentioned 7 times in the books of Daniel and Revelation, and it's sometimes referred to as 42 months, and sometimes it's referred to as 1,260 days. So there's things that we need to remember is that when you're calculating this, is that the Jewish people used a 30-day lunar calendar, and so instead of 28 and 31 like what we have, they used a 30-day monthly calendar, and then with 360 days in the year and not like 365 like us. So if you have 3.5 years, you multiply that times 360 days, and that gives us 1,260 days. And if we have the 42 months, then we can multiply that by 30 days. So the number of days that we get is also 1,260 days. So these time periods are all the same, 3.5 years and 42 months and 1,260 days. You'll see all of those throughout the Bible, and it's all referring to the same time period. It all ends up being that 1,260 days. But then the only other thing that we need to remember is that a prophetic day is equal to 1 literal year. So 1,260 days actually is 1,260 years. So basically we're saying that the papacy would stay in dominant for at least for 1,260 days, or years, excuse me. So now we get to the sea beast. Okay, the sea beast is discussed in Revelation 13, verses 1 through 10. So here we are in Revelation, and I just want to say real quickly for those that don't know, Revelation was written by the Apostle John, and of course he had written the Gospel of John, and he wrote 3 epistles, and he had been banished to the island of Patmos for speaking or preaching the Christian faith. And while he was on the island, he received visions from Jesus Christ, who is actually resurrected at this time. And then he wrote the book of Revelation, and the Revelation really just contains all these visions. And so in Revelation 13, he's describing one of those visions, and he's talking about a beast rising from the sea. So we have the depiction here. This is what it ends up looking like. So John sees this beast rising from the sea. Okay? And again, the Bible already told us that the sea represents peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So that means that this power arises from a densely populated area of the world, the heart of the old world. So it has 7 heads, 10 horns, and crowns. And so there we have that I already have read. Okay, and that was from Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. So let's go on to 2. So he continues the description of this beast in verse 2. He says, "Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, his mouth like the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority." Notice this beast is a combination of the same beast that Daniel saw, right? Remember, Daniel saw a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a terrible beast, right? Here, it's like this terrible beast, and it's mentioned that it's like a leopard and a bear and a lion. So the interesting thing is that this is in reverse. It's in the reverse order that what Daniel saw. The reason is Daniel was looking forward into the future. He was living at the time of Babylon, and he also lived actually during the Medo-Persian rule as well. But he's looking forward, so he sees them in the order that they were going to come to him. He sees the Babylon, and then Medo-Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. But in contrast, John is living at the time of Rome, so he's seeing it backwards. So there's in reverse order. So he goes from Rome to Greece to Medo-Persia to Babylon. But it tells us, the main thing here that why I'm explaining this is because it tells us that we're dealing with the same prophetic line of kingdoms, okay? But we're now going to zero in on a single power that arises from them both. So, by the way, who is this dragon that it talks about? It says that the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and his great authority. So we know Satan. That's right. Yep. Satan, and we get that from Revelation 12, verse 9, which says, "So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan." So when they're referencing the dragon, we're talking about Satan. So don't forget that. "Who deceives the whole world, he was cast out to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." So in Revelation 13, when it says that the dragon gave the beast his power, his throne, and his authority, it makes perfect sense. Satan is actually guiding the sea beast. So we go on to verse 4. "So they worship the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?'" Well, this is a very revealing verse. So that same dragon, Satan, who gave authority to the beast, is worshipped. And the people also worship the sea beast. So they're not just worshiping Satan. They are worshiping Satan, yes, but they're also worshiping the sea beast. And then verse 5 goes on, and it gives us more details. And eventually we're going to identify who this sea beast is, okay? But we just keep getting more and more details that we can help build to get this puzzle together, right? "And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. There's that 42 months. that we talked about. What's that? That's the same as 1,260 years, okay? So this beast is described with the characteristics that are just like the little horn in Daniel. He's described as being pompous, having pompous words and blasphemy. He rules for 42 months. And there are going to be some other similarities that we see. He's also a persecuting power. It says it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So this power would persecute God's people. And history confirms that. During the Dark Ages, millions stood for the Bible, were persecuted or killed. And this was one of the darkest chapters in the church's history. Like millions and millions were killed. So let's summarize these similarities side by side, okay? Because we've got quite a list here going, right? So first, we're going to look at Daniel 7 on the left, and then the corresponding verses that how we can see that the sea beast is really the same as the fourth beast and the little horn in Daniel 7. So both of them arise from the sea. They both had 10 horns, and they both had a mouth speaking great things. So Daniel 7 says it speaks great words against the Most High, and Revelation just gives a little more details, more specific, saying that it speaks blasphemy against God. And then they both make war with the saints, and I'm giving the verses there so that if you ever, wanted to look anything up, you can look up the verses and see exactly how it's worded. And then Daniel 7 says he devours the whole earth, and that's really basically the same thing as saying that he has power over all the nations. So, and then he has powers. There's that 3.5 years. He has power in Daniel 7. It said times and a half at times. That's 3.5 years. And the power and the sea beast, it says, is 42 months, which we talked about, 3.5 years. And then the sequence that we talked about is the interesting thing because it gives you the exact place and time that we're looking at. It goes from the lion to the bear to the leopard. And we said it was just the reverse, but we're talking about the same historical sequence in both Daniel 7 and Revelation 13. There we have some depictions. That's quite a little horn. So, as I said before, clearly we're meant to see a connection between the little horn and Daniel 7, right? We previously identified the little horn as the papacy. So the sea beast is described the same way, right? So they are, in fact, the little horn and the sea beast are one and the same. This means that the sea beast is none other than the papacy. Okay. And remember that we said that the dragon gave the sea beast its power. How was this accomplished in history, Satan giving his power to the papacy? Well, this is sort of an interesting story. Pagan Rome was the channel. Okay, when the Roman emperors moved the capital to Constantinople, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, it was called the Bishop of Rome then, inherited the throne from the Caesars. The dragon, through pagan Rome, gave its authority, its power, and its throne and great authority to the papacy. Okay, and we previously saw in Revelation 13, verse 4, that they worship the dragon who gave them authority to the beast, and they worship the beast. So the people would follow the beast with admiration and even worship it. So that people, and we know that is happening, right? They worship him and they do follow him with great admiration, right? So how did the papacy obtain and use the sword of the state? In other words, how did it get its civil authority? Well, between 300 AD and 476 AD, all these barbarian tribes came in from the north and invaded and basically carved up the Roman Empire. So the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was dethroned in 476 AD. So without an empire, they were totally thrown into turmoil. There was utter chaos. Okay, so the Bishop of Rome would take the reins of the civil power, and so he has this religious authority, but to get control over what was happening in that area, he assumed the authority over the civil power as well. So it united church and state. And then whenever those two powers are fused, whenever we unite church and state, history shows that it leads to persecution. It's not just the papacy that has done this, and there's other nations throughout history that have combined church and state. It just does not work well. There are always religious liberties that are taken away, or civil freedoms are taken away. But there's persecution when you combine them. Okay. As we said, Revelation 13:3, we've already talked about this, and I saw one of his heads as it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. So we talked about him following the beast, right? Well, he also ends up getting this deadly wound, right? History shows us that the papacy was dominant in power from 538 to 1798. And we'll talk about what happened in 1798. That's exactly 1,260 years, or that 42-month period that we saw both in Daniel 7 and in Revelation 13. In 1798, it was at the end of the French Revolution. The papacy received a deadly wound when General Berthier, under orders from Napoleon, marched in and took him captive and basically brought him back and put him in a cell. And he ended up dying in jail, if I'm not mistaken. So the French Revolution really it was catastrophic for the papacy. And the aftermath of the revolution, the country after country in the Western world actually followed suit, followed the example of France and the United States, and they established democratic governments. And they basically proclaimed their emancipation from the papacy's dominion. They just got out from under its thumb, from under its rule. So the deadly wound was given to the papacy when the sword of the state was that the papacy had used to persecute God's people turned against it. So a ruler used the civil power to take the Pope prisoner, but notice only one head of the beast is wounded, right? Remember how many heads he had? 7, right? So the beast with 7 heads that ruled consecutively, one at a time. But if you study Revelation 17, it shows that at this point in prophecy, 4 of the heads had already been killed. What were those 4 heads? We talked about them. They were already nations that had come and gone. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, right? And then the 5th is the papacy. And so it's the 5th head that actually receives this deadly wound. And it's actually going to be revived because it says it was healed, right? So we see that it's going to be healed and it's going to rule again as it did in the past. So in between, this beast has been convalescing, right, with a deadly wound. So it doesn't have the same power even now as what it had then. But it is rising in power, and we see this today. And the papacy is really in the process of being restored even now. If you remember, in 2015, the Pope came to the United States and spoke to Congress, and he was really well received. You know, both houses of Congress loved him, stood and applauded. Then he went to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he conducted a mass, and a number of things happened there, and he met with the leaders there. But, you know, even today with the new Pope Leo, he's following the same agenda, it seems, that the Pope Francis did when they came to met with the United Nations about climate change. And we know that all the leaders were really listening to him, and I think he had an agenda where by 2030 they were going to take major steps in getting rid of climate change. But the point is, not that climate change is going to be like this major issue at the end of the time. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I don't really know. But the point is that we can see how nations are giving the papacy a public platform, right? And it's regaining its prestige. So we can see how this former power that it did have, it's being gradually restored. More and more quickly as time goes by, I think, and we can see in our lifetime. So then Revelation 13:10 says, "He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." So if you study Revelation 13:10 carefully, it's going to show that the deadly wound doesn't just refer to the fact that the papacy lost control over a huge territory. All these nations kind of left from its jurisdiction and, established democracies. But it doesn't mean that the churches closed. The Roman Catholic faith kept going. The churches were still open, right? He was taken prisoner, but the churches kept going. They were still, functioning, and they still are today. But as we said earlier, the deadly wound was the removal of the sword of the state. Okay, this led the papacy into captivity because it could no longer use the power of the state to enforce its practices and its dogmas. Okay, it lost the power of the state. It didn't have that control anymore, and it still doesn't yet. Although it's working its way up. But when the beast could use a sword, the sword of kings, to accomplish its purposes, it was free, right? But when the kings removed the sword, it was in captivity. So that's exactly what we see that has happened here with the papacy. So the captivity mentioned here doesn't refer just to the fact that this pope was taken captive. It was more than that. It really was referring to the entire system that he represented went into captivity. And that brings us to the Lamb Beast, which is in Revelation 13, and it covers verses 11 through 18. So now we got to see who this second beast is that is talked about, and that we call the land beast. And is going to play a very significant part in the end time events, as you'll see. So it says, Revelation 13:11 says, "Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth." Here we have a depiction of it. "And it had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon." Well, it's interesting because I never really thought about it. I always kind of pictured this as a lamb, but here we have a buffalo. But if you think about it, they actually look a lot like lambs, right? So I kind of like this picture. It looks like a great big sort of beastly lamb, right? So, but this prophecy doesn't mean that the lamb beast acts simultaneously as a lamb and a dragon. At the beginning of its career, when the beast rises from the earth, it has 2 horns like a lamb, and it's only later on that he's going to actually speak like a dragon. So we're going to talk a little more about this verse here. So coming up out of the earth, what does that mean? We had talked about coming up out of the sea, right? And the fact that it meant like a really densely populated area. Well, coming up out of the earth basically means the opposite of that. So it's going to come from a very unpopulated area, a sparsely populated area. And then the phrase, 2 horns like a lamb. So it had 2 horns like a lamb. So a lamb is not full grown. So this would represent a young nation, right? While the lamb beast represents a single nation, it only represents one nation. It has 2 horns. And so this symbolizes the fact that within this single nation, there are 2 kingdoms that exist side by side. Okay? The 2 lamb-like horns symbolize the fact that the land beast kingdom is going to recognize 2 legitimate existences of 2 separate kingdoms within its body, right? It's going to recognize the existence of 2 of them, and that is church and state, right? They keep them separate. So there's 2 separate kingdoms within this one nation, okay? And notice that there's no crowns mentioned at all here. That means there's no kingly authority, so it's a democratic government. And then the lamb indicates that the nation's going to be gentle, like with Christ-like properties. So, and Christ is mentioned in the book of Revelation actually 28 times. The lamb is mentioned in the book of Revelation 28 times. And every single time that it's mentioned, it's referring to Christ. Okay, so we know that this is talking about, when it says lamb-like, it's saying Christ-like principles. So history confirms this, that it is the United States of America that we're talking about. Because the question is, what nation was rising to power around 1798 when the first beast received its deadly wound? So who was coming to power on 1798? Whose founding documents explicitly recognize the legitimate existence of 2 kingdoms that's keeping church and state separate, and it's a democracy? Well, the answer is kind of, irrefutable. It's the United States, right? And so history confirms that. Now, one thing I thought to include was that the pilgrims, they escaped papal persecution by coming to the United States. But unfortunately, they did not learn a lot from that, because even though they were escaping the tyranny of the Pope or the papacy, when they arrived in the New World, they committed some of the same mistakes. They had some of the same errors. In the colonies, you could be fined or even imprisoned for not attending church. And those who refused to conform were denied the right to vote. And, of course, that was men back then. It wasn't women. But they weren't allowed to vote. And the government even paid the salaries for the clergy then. So you could see that the church and the state were still entangled. So there was still persecution that was happening even then. I really like this quote from Roger Williams. He says, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." Roger Williams, so he lived during the colonial period from 1603 to 1683. He was actually banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for spreading new and dangerous opinions. He advocated the separation of church and state and the rights of Native Americans, actually. And he ended up being banished. He went to Rhode Island, and he established Providence, which was like a haven for people for religious freedom. And so the reason I'm mentioning him is because really his vision anticipated what would be in the First Amendment. He saw what many other people miss, that worship can't be forced, that it must come from the heart. So in other words, there should be separation of church and state. So the Founding Fathers remembered this, the lessons of the persecutions in Europe and the persecution in the colonies. And so they were determined to protect liberty of conscience. So they built this new government, our government, on religious freedom and civil liberty. So look at the timing here. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, right? Giving people rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as it says. In 1787, the U.S. Constitution was signed, establishing the government, for the people, by the people. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified, and it contained the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and those are the ones that actually talk about religious freedom and liberty of conscience. And then in 1798, that's when the papacy's deadly wound happened. So we can see that how the United States was rising right during that time when the papacy received its deadly wound. And then the last part of this verse we've talked a lot about, but he spake like a dragon. So he starts as a lamb, but he's going to end up speaking like a dragon. So we know that the United States has a clear separation of church and state, like no place else in the world probably, but this indicates that freedom isn't going to last forever. So even though we're founded on liberty, and prophecy warns us that the United States is going to turn back on its principles and begin legislating coercion in matters of faith. So the lamb-like horns will remain. It still will have like the First Amendment in its books probably, but the dragon's voice, the Satan's principles of force will be heard. Hence, he spoke like a dragon, right? So Revelation 13:12 says, "And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in the presence and causes in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed." Remember earlier we said that the dragon gave the sea beast its power, its throne, and authority, and we identified the dragon as Satan, right? So it was the dragon, Satan, through pagan Rome, who attempted to kill the male child, right? That was Jesus, right? That's what Revelation 12 says. It was the dragon, Satan, then, who worked through papal Rome and persecuted the women for 1,260 years after the child had ascended to heaven. And Revelation 12 tells us that too. And it will be the dragon, Satan, through resurrected papal Rome, with the aid of the land beast, that's going to persecute the remnant of the woman's seed when the deadly wound is healed. So after convalescing for a period of time, the wound will be healed by the land beast, who will speak like a dragon. This must mean that the land beast will not only be a spokesperson for Satan, but he's also going to be a spokesperson for Rome. And so this dragon, the sea beast, and the land beast are all agents of Satan. the dragon, the sea beast, well, the dragon is Satan, the sea beast and the land beast, they're all agents of Satan who operates through Rome. So everything the second beast does is linked with the first beast, and it compels, notice, it says it causes, so it's forcing, it's using coercion, right? And so that the world will worship the first beast. The land beast will exercise all the authority of the first beast in the same way that the first beast exercised authority, that of the dragon beast. So there is a passing of the baton, basically, from the dragon to the sea beast to the land beast. You can see it just flow, right? So the second beast does everything for the first beast, is really what we're saying. If the land beast is going to cause everyone on earth to worship the sea beast or the papacy, then the land beast must help the sea beast in tearing down 3 walls that prevent the papacy from exercising world dominion. So one of these walls is the wall between Protestants and Catholics. So the United States is going to help to break these walls down. The wall between Protestants and Catholics. We see that happening now. Protestants have been like leaders, some of those television evangelists and stuff have actually been to see the Pope. There's agreements that have been made between the Lutherans and the Pope regarding certain things. So they're beginning to already break down this wall. The second wall is the one between church and state. So that's going to have to be gotten rid of, because basically the papacy is going to go back to using church and state, and so is the United States, actually. They're going to start mingling things, and people's liberties are going to be taken away. And then the third wall is the one between Catholicism and then the secular-minded worldlings. And so that wall is going to have to be broken. So somehow or another, if the papacy is going to have dominion over the entire world, you're going to have to get the worldlings interested as well. And that wall is going to have to be broken down. And is that really truly what the papacy is trying to accomplish? Some may say, well, I don't know about that. There's a Jesuit priest, he's dead now, I think he died in 1987, to give you an idea about when he wrote. His name is Malachi Martin. Some of you might be familiar with him. He wrote a book called The Keys of This Blood, or the Keys of This Blood, yeah. And he also wrote a book called The Jesuits. But in the book, The Keys of This Blood, he describes that there's this competition for global control. And this competition is between 3 entities, or 3 powers, and they all start with C. Communism, capitalism, and Catholicism. So there's this competition, he says, and here's what he actually says. This is a quote from Malachi Martin. There is one great similarity shared by all 3 of these globalist competitors. Each one has in his mind a particular grand scheme for one world governance. Their geopolitical competition is about which of the 3 will form, dominate, and run the world system that will replace the decaying nation system. And so according to Malachi Martin, he says that is the goal of the papacy, is to run the world. He comes spot on and says it. That's what they're trying to do. Now, we're going to go on and find some other things out about this land beast. It talks about some actions here in Revelation 13:13, and it says, he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. So that, of course, fire coming down from heaven is reminiscent of course, Pentecost. It's also reminiscent of Elijah, right? Remember when he was made that big altar and put the wood on it, and then he put water all over it a bunch of times, right? And I don't know how many times. Some of you probably know how many times. I don't know how many times, but he put all this water over it. But even so, power from God comes down, fire comes down, and the whole thing is consumed, right? Even though all that water was put on it. So at the end of time, this land beast is going to counterfeit that miracle. The beast from the earth is also known, and this gets a little complicated, as the false prophet. And we find that out later in Revelation. But how do we know that this reference to the false prophet is referring to the land beast? Well, if you think about what he's doing here, he's bringing fire down from heaven. Look at his actions, right? So it's the counterfeit Elijah is really what they're talking about. And so what happens is the fire from heaven persuades multitudes, millions of people probably, that the message of the false prophet is true, and the whole world will wonder after the beast and follow it. So these miracles are going to be done that are going to convince people. And then Revelation 13:14 says, "And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do." So that bringing fire down is one of them. There's going to be other signs that he's going to be granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and who lived. And so wounded by the sword and lived, we know it's talking once again about the papacy, right? So people are going to be deceived by this land beast or this false prophet. We find out that eventually they don't even use the term false land beast in Revelation. It totally just switches and calls it the false prophet. But because of the miracles that are going to be done, so people are going to be deceived. And now we see something even more concerning about how the United States is going to be involved in the end time crisis. The land beast builds an image to the first beast, right? And so what is an image? And how is it going to be formed in our world today? Well, we know an image is a reflection. We see our image in the mirror. It's a reflection of us, right? So the image is going to be a copy of the papal system. And then to learn how the image is formed and what it's like, we should study the characteristics of the papacy, which we already have done. Think about how the sea beast or the papacy ruled in history. It joined religion and government. Worship was enforced by law, and those who resisted faced persecution. So Revelation tells us the same pattern is going to be copied, and this time here in America. So that's the blueprint that Revelation is giving us. It's warning us that it's going to be repeated. Because the land beast enforces worship, it must be driven by a group that is religious in nature. And the religious leaders here in the United States are going to put pressure on the secular government, on the secular power, to safeguard their policies and to punish those that oppose them. And that's what we see happening. In this way, when that happens, they're going to be making an image of the beast, or an image of the papacy. And then verse 15 says, he was granted power to give breath, to the image of the beast. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image to be killed. So that's really drastic. We know that there's going to be people killed during this time. So the land beast will speak and cause. So there's coercion that's going to be used. So the question is, how does the United States speak? Yeah, through legislation. We have representatives, and they pass legislation and they pass laws, and so that's basically how we speak, through the legislative and the judicial authority. So it speaks through Congress, and people are going to be killed. So by making an image to the first beast, the United States is going to disown and contradict its founding documents, right? The principles that make an image or a replica of what the papacy did during the 1260 years. So civil and religious liberties are going to be taken away, and persecutions are going to follow. And as a result, much of the history of what the papacy did to the reformers, and even what the Sanhedrin did to Jesus, is going to be repeated at the end of time. That's where they're combining church and state. We know that the Sanhedrin used the civil authorities to actually try Jesus. And then finally, verse 16 says, and he causes all, both great and small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand and on their foreheads. So we're told that this nation is going to speak like a dragon. The land beast will command or force people to worship the image of the first beast and receive its mark. Coercion is one of the ways that the dragon speaks. So the land beast is going to force everybody to receive this mark. Okay, at this point, we don't know from Revelation 13:16 exactly what the mark is, but we do know that the land beast is going to compel everybody to receive this mark. And we know that from the prior verse that it involves worship, because those who don't worship the image are going to be killed, right? So we know that it involves worship. We know that that there's going to be coercion involved. So because people are being compelled, I think that we can surmise that this compulsion is enforced by the enactment of a law. And so that law is going to involve worship. So on the right hand where it says here, that means that the people may not believe that it's right to go along with what they're doing, with what they're being forced to do. They may not think it's right, but they're going to do it anyway. So it's sort of like it's out of convenience. Yeah, and then on the forehead means that they think that they're truly convinced that the beast is right, and they're going to follow whatever they say. So here in verse 17, we learn a little bit more about this. It says that and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So people are going to be prohibited from buying and selling. And once again, it makes it sound like there might be laws passed, but we also know that there's ways to confiscate people's money, especially with digital money these days. So once again, the people that have the mark on their right hand, that they may not really believe that what they're doing they should be doing, but because they're afraid that they're not going to be able to buy or sell, they're going to go ahead and just do the actions anyways. They're going to basically be worshiping the beast and following him. And then the name that it talks about here, we aren't going to have a lot of time to talk about this name and the number, but the name is believed to be Vicarious Fili Dei, which means one who takes the place of the Son of God, or one who is the vicar of Jesus Christ. And then it says, here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, 666. So you have to calculate to come up with the number, right? So, and it's a number of a man. And a better translation I have heard is actually that it is the number of man. Okay? There's no indefinite article there. But although there's not a total consensus on this, but if you take the name Vicarious Fili Dei, which is the one who is the vicar of the Son of God, and if you look at the Roman letters in that name, they're going to add up to 666. Like the V, is 5, right? The I is 1. And so I forget what all of them are. I forget what F is. But anyways, if you add all those up, they're going to come to 666. And I will say that the papacy denies that they use this title, but there's been evidence that shows something to the contrary, that they do use that title. So regarding the exact nature of the mark that we've discussed, we know that it's tied to worship, and that the land beast is going to deceive people and tell them to make an image of the first beast, and then that's going to force them to worship. It's going to force them to worship or be killed. And the same land beast, the United States, is going to coerce people to receive a mark that apparently involves change in laws. We also know that those who receive the mark will have it on their right hands and on their foreheads, and that we won't be able to buy or sell. So that's how much we know about it thus far. But we haven't talked about exactly what it is. Well, I know people have really long speculated on that, and we are going to go into more detail on that in a future presentation, I will say. So you'll have to tune in. Okay? So stay tuned. We will have that presentation in, I think, a week or so. Next week, yeah. So when churches in America get together on a common issue and then influence the state to enforce laws to accomplish their goals, they will have formed an image to the beast. That's the emblem, actually, for the papacy. I don't know if you know that or not. We can already see some religious groups that are pushing for the civil authorities to enforce laws that would help their goals be realized. So what are these that are happening right now in the United States? We've got the Christian right. For example, there's a growing movement of people who hold the views that it's important to be patriotic and it's important to be Christian. And if you are Christian, you must be patriotic. There's people that believe this. It's Christian nationalism it's also called, and it's been defined as the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity, and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. That's actually a definition that's been used. So they believe that we're defined by Christianity, the American nation, and that the government should take active steps to keep that way. They seem to think that society would work best if church and state were combined, where the state can actually mandate religious things. The religious right really started probably in the 1970s with Roe versus Wade, when the Supreme Court made a decision that legalized abortion. And they also, at that time period, were banning school prayer. And so this movement really got solidified with its alliance to the Republican Party and that was in the 1980s, and it's really grown from there. So they support things like school prayer, the Ten Commandments being displayed, and they also lobby for moral laws like Sunday sacredness, marriage laws, and that type of thing. And it is kind of ironic that they think that that we're a Christian nation, and that we can use the civil authorities to enforce their law or their policies, when we know quite well from what we've discussed that the founding fathers absolutely intentionally separated church and state. So it is kind of ironic that they're said to be patriotic, and then to have this on the other hand, that they want to have their agenda enforced by law. So also Project 2025, I know you've heard of that, and it's actually being implemented like right now. There were 350 people that actually got together and came up with this. It's basically a blueprint for conservatism. And it's actually, like I said, it's really this administration that's currently in office. They are actually using this, and by doing so, they are really enforcing conservative values within the government. So a lot is happening with the Christian right, but we also have the Christian left, and a lot of people don't acknowledge this as something that could potentially have anything to do with this creating an image of the papacy. But the Christian left is really growing. It's alive and growing. It pushes for social justice reforms and tied to religious duty, like climate change, for example. And they push for climate change laws and the associated Sunday rest laws. They also push for laws that mandate fairness or a moral vision enforced through policy. For example, like issues like environmental action, LGBTQ rights, and women's reproductive health rights. They are concerned about immigration and racial equity. They're concerned about affordable housing and wealth disparity, and so they're getting very well known and more prominent in the public eye, and they're really trying to let their voice be heard and trying to have laws that are and it is a religious left, so it's motivated by religious values. They really identify with Christ's love and inclusion of marginalized people. And so they have these moral values that they want actually implemented and put into effect by using the civil government. So really what we have here, though they look different, we've got the Christian right and the Christian left, but they both end up in the same place. It's like two streams flowing down a mountainside, and they meet in the same valley. So they're very different, but they unite, and they come together uniting with the state to enforce religion. That's what they're both aiming for. And the issue really isn't left or right. It's forced worship versus freedom of conscience. So we can see from our study of Revelation 13 that the United States is going to violate its founding principles, right, of civil and religious liberty. Well, how can a government-mandated worship, how can that happen? How can that possibly happen in the United States? And I'd say, there's a few scenarios, I'm sure, that could work out a lot more than what I can imagine. But remember that the United States still is that beast with two horns. But at the same time, it's going to speak like a dragon. So it's going to still say it still stands for religious liberty and civil liberty. But it will speak, it's going to pass laws that will reflect the dragon. So the United States won't get rid of the First Amendment, but it'll do things like pass laws that'll go against it. So we have three, I'm just going to quickly go through this. We have three branches of the United States government. We've got the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and we've got the executive branch. So the executive branch enforces the laws, right? And that's like the president and the cabinet. And then we have the legislative branch that writes the laws. So that's like Congress, okay? And then we have the judicial branch that actually interprets the laws, okay? And that's like the Supreme Court and all the courts of appeals and the district courts of appeals and all that. So each of these branches could play a part in reversing the separation of church and state. Let's say, for example, the executive branch. Let's say that the president enforces a law that's unconstitutional. He's like, I'm going to do this. I don't care if it's unconstitutional or not, we're doing it, right? And then let's say somebody appeals that and says, this is unconstitutional, you can't do this, you're taking away some of my liberties, my civil liberties, or my religious liberties. And so where did it go to? Eventually those type of things are appealed and they go to the Supreme Court of the United States, okay? Well, what happens, though, if the Supreme Court decides that, well, yeah, we don't think it's unconstitutional. We don't think their liberties are being taken away. And so they say, nah, it's not unconstitutional. We're saying it's lawful. We're saying it's totally within the law for them to do this. Well, if the people that their rights have been violated want to bring it any further, there's no place else to appeal. The Supreme Court, what they say goes. There's no place else to go. So it's like scenarios like that could happen. That this actually, it sounds very improbable, but it can definitely happen. Think about what happened with the Chads in Florida. Remember the hanging Chads and stuff? It was actually the Supreme Court that ended up deciding who was president. It really was. It came up to them and they decided. So they do have a lot of power here in the United States. So we know that this is going to go worldwide, right? There's going to be, we're setting a stage for a worldwide law that is going to be enforced. It's going to have to do with this mark of the beast. So we know that a global crisis can unite people. We know that very well from the recent COVID pandemic, right? That religious groups will be willing to push the civil authorities to act in a way to end the crisis, okay? And we can see how people can justify making laws or taking actions that actually take away people's civil liberties. We saw that happen during COVID, right? So it doesn't matter if the people are from the religious left or the religious right. We can see that if there's a global crisis, it's going to unite people, and they're going to want to do something that's going to alleviate the crisis in hand, the chaos that's going to come out. Jesus foretold all these events in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. We see them. The rumors of war, wars and rumors of war, nation rising against nation, pestilences, earthquakes. The love of many are going to grow cold. So we see all that happening now. At some point, though, things are going to get so bad, I see it, that people are going to beg for order and for control and for safety, right? And, the suggestion that instituting a Sunday law, passing a law that Sunday would be a day of rest, may be seen as a logical solution to some of the world problems. Like we have seen that recommended for climate change. So they may not necessarily do it on Sunday, but they want to do some kind of a day to make it to have a day of rest where we're not going to have so many emissions. So a day of rest could also restore family unity, we're told. So by restoring family unity, then you can help this love that has gone cold, right? And maybe lower crime rate. So all of these things could set the stage for a worldwide law. And other things that could set the stage for it are like terrorist attacks, riots, escalating crime, a huge global economic crisis, another pandemic, nuclear threats or even war, all these things, political and social issues, terrible natural disasters. So the United States as a land beast will no doubt lead the way in changing laws to mitigate the terrible world conditions. And we can see that in prophecy. So country after country will follow. And whoever is leading the world at that time will see that the entire world follows suit. And remember, Malachi Martin suggested that the papacy wants to really control the world. This is something that he did say that he has no doubt who will win the competition, that the papacy is going to win that competition. Remember the 3 C's: capitalism, communism, and Catholicism. Here's a quote that he said. This tells us what it's going to be like. He says, "No holds barred, because once the competition has been decided, the world and all that's in it, our way of life as individuals and citizens of the nations, our families and our jobs, our trade and commerce and money, our educational systems and our religions and our cultures, even the badges of our national identity, which most of us have always taken for granted, all will have been powerfully and radically altered forever. No one can be exempted from its effects. No sector of our lives will remain untouched. Nobody who is acquainted with the plans of these 3 rivals has any doubt but that only one of them can win." And he says that that's going to be the papacy. So what's the answer? Revelation 14:12 we're familiar with. We've talked a little bit about it in some of our presentations, and I think we're going to talk a lot more about it. This prophecy really isn't about political parties. The real issue is worship. Who will we worship? Will it be God freely and in truth, or will it be the beast through coercion and through laws? That's the crisis that lies ahead. Revelation 14:12 tells us who's going to survive this ordeal. It says, "Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." So people that are living during the time of the mark of the beast will have a choice. They'll either keep the commandments of God, or they'll decide not to keep the commandments of God, right? Just as the Sabbath is the specific sign of God's authority, the mark of the beast refers to the sign associated with the sea beast, or the little horn, the one symbolizing the papacy. So remember that the papacy received its power from Satan, right? So this mark is actually the devil's mark. So you're going to have a choice. You can keep the commandments of God, or you can get this devil's mark, right, and support the devil. I had my previous presentation on the 10 Commandments. We talked about the fact that we need Christ and His righteousness to help us to obey the 10 Commandments. So people won't do it by their own will. They're not going to keep the 10 Commandments by their own will, but they're going to rely on Christ's righteousness. They don't survive by their own strength. They'll endure because they have the faith of Jesus. That means trusting in His righteousness and His victory that He's already had and His grace. So at the end of time, the world's going to divide into 2 images, the image of the beast and the image of Christ. The beast uses power, law, and force, and Christ uses love, truth, and righteousness. And the question is, which image is going to be seen in us? The image of the beast is built on human power, laws, politics, and coercion, but the seal of God is built on Christ's righteousness. It's not about what I can do, but it's about who I trust. And we need to trust Jesus. He clothes us in His righteousness. He fills us with His Spirit. And His law is in our hearts. We know that there will be people who survive this crisis. And they're the ones that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. So the real question tonight is not, will there be an image of the beast? We know there's going to be an image of the beast. The real question is, will there be an image of Christ in me? So tonight, Jesus is calling us to reflect His image, not the beast. To let His righteousness cover us, His Spirit strengthen us, and His love to guide us. And so all we have to do is just ask. So don't wait for laws to force a decision. We need to choose Jesus tonight. So stand with those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus.
Amen. Amen.
And I think we have a closing song.